Welcome to Office Hours with Peter Hannick. I'd like to respond in this video to a specific kind of feedback that I received a lot of in my response to Sam Harris's podcast, episode 207. And that specifically regards comments that I had made about resisting arrest and complying with arrest and what I described as unlawful arrests. You know, one of the funny things about being a professor is that, you stand in front of a room and you prepare your lecture, you prepare your slides, and you talk to your students and you think you're saying something, but you don't really know how effectively you've communicated something until you ask the students to write exams or write essays, and then you read them and you say, well, gosh, is that what you got from what I was saying? Then maybe I need to be a lot more clear. And I think this might be an area where I probably should be a lot more clear. Specifically, the feedback that I received from a lot of people was that it showed some ambiguity about what I meant by unlawful arrest. So I want to be really clear about that, and I want to define what that means, so we can be really precise about terms. But at the very start, what I'd like to very clearly address was a comment that a few people made, not a lot, but a few people had made, which some people had taken my comments to mean that I supported fighting police officers if you don't want to be arrested. And insofar as that is what some people may have taken away from my response to Sam Harris, I would like to be very clear and very unambiguous. You should not fight police officers. It is a very, very bad idea to fight a police officer just because you don't want to be arrested. Or even, and here I'm going to be clear too, even if you think the police officer might be wrong. Okay, so now I understand some people are going to hear what I'm saying now and say, well, how do you reconcile that with what you said in the podcast? And so here I want to get deeper in what I mean by an unlawful arrest. This idea of unlawful. I'm gonna go back, right? I'm gonna go back pretty far, and I'm gonna go back all the way to Saint Augustine of Hippo, who is an early Christian philosopher, sometimes referred to as a father of the church, and he was very influenced by the Greek philosophers, and specifically one of the things that Augustine made a distinction between was just and unjust wars. And regarding just and unjust wars, Augustine evoked two ideas. One was what he called jus in bello, and the other being jus ad bellum. And what those refer to is the jus ad bellum would kind of translate as a just cause. And jus in bello is justice in the way you execute the war. And what Augustine was trying to get at was this idea of, can a war be just? Can a war be justified? A war which is inherently violent, inherently people are going to die. So how could we say that something like that, which costs so many lives, which poses such dangers to civilians, be justified? And what Augustine said is, well, if it's going to be justified, it has to be justified on two bases. One is the just cause. You have to have a good reason for entering the war. The reason that Augustine thought was a good reason was self-defense or defense of others. So if your country is invaded, of course you're allowed to defend yourself. And if one of your allies is invaded, you're allowed to come in defense of your ally. So that would be a just cause. But what Augustine wanted to make really, really clear, and I hope that you see where I'm going with this, was that having a just cause doesn't mean, okay, now we get to do whatever we want because we're fighting in self-defense, right? So, okay, so our country gets invaded, so now we get to start bombing civilians. No. Now we get to gas populations. No. Just because you have a just basis for going to war doesn't mean that now the gloves are off and you can do whatever you want. There still have to be just means in the way you execute the war, in the way you carry out the war. This distinction between just cause and just means is profoundly influential in Western thought, and specifically profoundly influential in law, in the way that we think about reasons why we do something, and then the way that we carry them out. And we find both of these two ideas enshrined in the Fourth Amendment. In the Fourth Amendment, the framers of the Constitution state both the basis upon which an arrest can be made and the way in which the arrest must be carried out. So specifically, they state that an arrest must be based upon probable cause. That is, probable cause that a crime occurred and that the person you're arresting is the person who did it. But they don't stop there, right? They don't just say like, oh, once you have probable cause, do whatever you want. Rather, they say that an arrest must be reasonable. Specifically, the Fourth Amendment forbids unreasonable searches and seizures. And in the language of the Constitution, an arrest is a seizure. And also, to be really clear, as regarding other kinds of conversations that we've been having and the kinds of conversations that were had in Sam Harris's podcast, uses of force are considered a seizure, right? You're seizing somebody. So you have to have just cause, right? Probable cause, and just means, reasonable, right? A reasonable seizure. All right, so this is where things get really tricky. An area which I think maybe some folks got confused by what I was saying, and which again, I will take the blame for not being clear enough, was it is very, very possible for an arrest of an innocent person to be entirely lawful. It is very, very possible for an arrest of an innocent person to be based upon probable cause. So think back to any police procedural you've ever seen, like Law and Order or something, right? The first person they arrest, that person is always innocent, right? Like that person never did it. So does that mean that arrest was unlawful? No, right? Because that arrest still could have been based upon probable cause. Probable cause doesn't mean the person literally, factually did it. Rather, what it means is that the officer, and specifically, you might bring a judge involved in this, you might bring a district attorney involved in this, but that people believe, right, that there is probable cause, that there's enough basis of evidence there to arrest somebody. It doesn't mean that they had to have actually done it. So the confusion is, when Sam Harris is saying like, oh, people think that they're innocent, therefore, if you think you're innocent, the police are wrong to arrest you, right? You shouldn't resist that arrest. You shouldn't fight back. And then I was kind of pushing back against that general statement. The confusion could be just because someone arrests you and you're innocent doesn't make that an unlawful arrest. What I was specifically trying to reference was the idea of unlawful arrests. So what could make an arrest unlawful? Well, it could not be based upon probable cause, which again doesn't mean you're innocent or guilty, just that there's not enough evidence. Well, that's something that's almost going to be impossible for the person being arrested to know. So you don't know the basis by which an arrest is being made. So you could know in your heart of hearts that you're innocent, but that doesn't make the arrest unlawful. So when I was suggesting that there might be a reason for people to push back against unlawful arrests, I want to be really clear. I'm not saying just because you're innocent you should fight back, right? Just because you're innocent you should resist. And again, to be very, very clear, I am not encouraging people legally or practically to fight the police. I think that's a very poor idea. What I was specifically pushing back against was the idea of not just cause or unjust cause, right? That probable cause evidence issue, but just means. And the idea that an arrest can be unlawful if it is unreasonable. If it is unreasonable in the way that it is carried out. So when a police officer makes an arrest, they could have a legitimate basis for that or an illegitimate basis for that. You could be innocent, you could be guilty. That's not really what I was talking about. What I was talking about is, assume that they have probable cause, even if you're innocent. Does that mean that any force that gets used is appropriate? And the answer to that, of course, is no. And specifically this idea of people resisting these unlawful uses of force, these cases of excessive force. Should people just be passive while force is being used against them in a way that might cause them death or serious injury? And I want to really push back against that idea. As the courts have held, again, different courts have interpreted this in different ways, but generally speaking, there has been consensus that an unlawful arrest that's carried out unlawfully, right, regardless of the basis of the arrest, but an arrest that's carried out using unlawful means, using excessive force, is no longer an arrest. It's a battery, right? And you don't waive your right to self-defense because the person who's attacking you, the person who's battering you, is a police officer, right? So a police officer could have a completely legitimate basis for arresting you, probable cause, which again is at some point, to some extent, is independent of whether you did or did not do it. But just because they have that legitimate basis for arresting you doesn't mean that you now have to sit back and take whatever happens to you. If unlawful force, if excessive force is used, you have a right to resist that. Right? You have a right to protect your own life. And when these cases arise, as these kinds of cases have, and that's why we're talking about them, where people are killed at the hands of the police, the question is, the fact that they put up any resistance in the face of excessive force, does that justify further force against them? Does that justify their death? Does that justify what happens to them? The fact that they should have just complied. And I think it's especially troubling in light of the fact that, when we look at some of the most high-profile cases, right, the case of George Floyd, the case of Eric Garner, you have what on face is a non-lethal application of force, right? At least on the books, the application of force would check the box for non-lethal. But the person receiving that force knew the effect of it was seriously injuring them, right? Both Eric Garner and George Floyd are exclaiming, "I can't breathe." Are they supposed to just suffocate? And that's where I really strongly push back against that, right? So again, if anyone took what I said to say you should fight the police, or that you should fight police officers just because you disagree with what they're doing, or you think you're innocent, if that's what came across, then that's my bad, right? But the idea that an arrest made on lawful grounds could still become unlawful in the way that it's carried out, that I think is a really important point and really worth considering. And I think it's a nuance that can get lost in this conversation. So thanks for listening. And if you have further questions or comments in office hours, please post them below, and maybe I'll get back to you.